where we may know who our elected officials are and what their actions are, and that they may be held accountable for those actions so that a democratic republic can function.
Will the gentleman from Texas yield?
I will yield for purpose of a question without yielding the floor.
It occurs to me as I think of this question that I'm about to ask you that inevitably one constitutional violation facilitates another. It cannot be that you violate one aspect of the Constitution in this circumstance, especially where you're tinkering with the lawmaking power, in ways that impact both federalism, the relative power of the states and localities on the one hand, vis-a-vis the federal government on the other hand, and also when you manipulate the power to legislate, the power to impose taxes. Anytime you distort the operation of the legislative power, anytime you allow the judicial branch to commandeer the legislative machinery from Congress, you're also distorting the accountability that you describe. So in other words, you have in the Patient Protection and Affordable Care Act a massive intrusion by the federal government into the sovereign authority that is retained by the states and by the people. The bigger the legislative package, the bigger the intrusion, and the greater the potential threat to federalism. The more removed that legislative package is from the people's elected representatives in the House and in the Senate, the greater the potential distortion that is at play in the constitutional system. So what we have at the end of the day is a new tax. Nobody knows who to blame. When the people are upset that they're going to be paying this tax, who do they blame? Well, they go to their members of Congress. You ask any member of Congress who's still here, who was here when this was enacted, any member of Congress who voted for the Patient Protection and Affordable Care Act, and I can pretty well guarantee you they're going to say, oh no, I didn't vote for a middle-class tax hike. I did not vote to impose a new tax on middle-class Americans. No, no. I voted for this, but I didn't vote for that because this imposed a penalty and not a tax. I know that because even in the wake of the Supreme Court's ruling in 2012, people who supported this legislation in the House and in the Senate and in the White House continued to insist, no, this is not a tax, this is a penalty. This notwithstanding the fact that the Supreme Court of the United States concluded that it could not be upheld as a penalty, that it could be upheld only as an exercise of Congress's authority to tax, authority which Congress decidedly did not exercise. So the accountability is thrown off severely. This is what prompted me to introduce a piece of legislation, Senate Bill 560. Senate Bill 560, which stands in rather stark contrast to the Patient Protection and Affordable Care Act with its 2,700 pages and 20,000 pages of implementing regulations. Senate Bill 560, one page. And here's what it says. To paraphrase, Section 1501 of the Patient Protection and Affordable Care Act, the individual mandate provision, is hereby amended as follows. Nothing in this provision shall be interpreted as a tax or as a valid exercise of Congress's power to tax pursuant to Article 1, Section 8, Clause 1, or the 16th Amendment. See, the beautiful part of Senate Bill 560 is that it gives those who voted for Obamacare, those in Congress who still defend Obamacare as something other than a tax on the middle class, an opportunity to register that belief. to register that belief by a vote that would say, yes, I don't believe this is a tax, and it should not be considered as a tax by the courts, and it should not be upheld by the courts as a tax. It should not be construed under any circumstance as a tax because we don't regard it as that. The interesting thing, of course, is that that's naturally the way that people who are the law's biggest defenders would like to vote in some respects, because they want to tell the American public, and they still are telling the American public, it's not a tax, it's a penalty. But if, in fact, they actually put their vote in that direction, if they put their money where their mouth is, and they pass that into law, well, guess what happens to the Supreme Court's ruling? What would happen to the Supreme Court's ruling in that circumstance, Senator Cruz, if we were to pass Senate Bill 560 into law? Let's just assume that somehow magically it passed the House and the Senate and President Obama signed it. Perhaps it united both parties behind this concept that, yeah, this is not a tax. What then would become of the Supreme Court's ruling upholding the Patient Protection and Affordable Care Act on that basis?
Well, it's an excellent question from Senator Lee. It's an excellent question from Senator Lee. And the answer is quite simple. If Congress acted to make clear that nothing in the Affordable Care Act created a tax, that would remove the entire basis for the Supreme Court's upholding Obamacare. And indeed, it would be a relatively simple matter in subsequent litigation for the Court to conclude under the matters it's already concluded that the other bases for upholding the Act are not present. Now, when you have elected officials that go to the people and go to the people, as Senator Lee quite rightly noted, and still say it's not a tax, you would think they would happily vote for it, except there's a vested interest, and I would note there's a difference between calling this a tax when Congress said and says it's not, and the examples we went through of the 100 Years' War and the Purple Finch, in that those are relatively innocuous misnomers, where this is something designed to be actively deceptive. Indeed, another one you could add to that litany we went through is you might think that if an act was titled, quote, an act to amend the Internal Revenue Code of 1986 to modify the first-time home buyer's credit in the case of members of the armed forces, you might think that if that's the title of an act, that it would concern something about the first-time home buyer's credit, perhaps even members of the armed forces. And depending on the content of it, it might even be an act that Senator Lee and I together would support. And yet, think again. That act is Obamacare. This is the 2,000-plus pages of Obamacare, a little bit worse for wear. And right on the cover of it, on page 1, December 24, 2009, ordered to be printed and passed. Resolved that the bill from the House of Representatives titled H.R. 3590, entitled An Act to Amend the Internal Revenue Code of 1986 to modify the first-time homebuyer's credit in cases of members of the armed forces and certain other federal employees and for other purposes, do pass the following. And then what was the amendment that was done? Strike out all after the enacting clause and insert. So everything about the first-time homebuyer's credit, everything about the armed forces, that all got erased. Title stayed there, but it all got erased, and suddenly Obamacare was born. Now, look, that was a creature, that was a fact that came out of the procedural games that had to be played to force Obamacare into law in a straight party line vote. But I would note that this body has not forgotten how to play those games. And indeed, I would ask, again rhetorically to the body, is the game that the Democratic majority of Congress played in passing Obamacare, saying it was not a tax when in fact it was a tax when it was not a tax, any different than what right now some members of the Republican conference are doing when they say they will vote for foreclosure in order to give Harry Reid and the Senate Democrats the ability to fully fund Obamacare, and that they will do so because they want to defund Obamacare. Is that fundamentally any different? Presenting one story to tell the voters and a different story in terms of what will happen in this body when it comes to accountability. I wonder if we're seeing much the same games played out again. Games that undermine the integrity of this institution, games that undermine the confidence the American people have that our elected representatives listen to us.
Will the gentleman from Texas yield for a question?
I'm happy to yield for purpose of a question without yielding the floor.
It certainly is important that we call something by an appropriate name. It was important back then that the Congress appropriately name what it was doing. It was appropriate back then for the Congress to say, we are enforcing the individual mandate through a penalty and not through a tax. In fact, it was so important that, but for Congress's decision to make this a penalty and not a tax, it would never have passed in the first place. What you call something and what you make of it can mean all the difference between passage and failure of a particular legislative proposal. When you dress something up in different language, something might appear to be more palatable than it actually is. Certainly, it could be argued that if there are people among us, if there are Republicans among us who are saying that if you support the House-passed continuing resolution, then you must vote for cloture on the bill, cloture on the House-passed resolution. That would not be accurate, in my opinion. I would respectfully but strongly disagree with someone who would make that claim. I certainly do not believe that it's accurate to say that if you support the House-passed continuing resolution, the one that keeps government funded but defunds Obamacare at the same time, I think it would be inaccurate to say that you must vote yes on cloture on the bill in this circumstance. It's not to say that in every circumstance you would have to vote no. In fact, it seems counterintuitive when you first approach it to say, why would you vote no on cloture on a bill that you like? Well, there's one circumstance where I can see where you'd want to do that. It's a circumstance in which the continuing resolution that you want to support moves over from the House of Representatives, and there are three alternatives. Three alternatives the Senate could consider, but the Senate chooses only the third. Three doors that the majority leader could choose to open. He chooses only the third. The first door is one in which he says, okay, we're going to vote on this. We're going to vote on it up or down on its merits as is. We're going to vote on it as it was passed by the House of Representatives. Behind door two is another option. We're going to allow amendments. We're going to allow individual members, Democrats and Republicans, to submit amendments as they deem fit. We'll debate and discuss those amendments. We will consider them. We will vote on them. Some of them may pass. Some of them may not pass. But we will get to amendments. Door one is okay. Door two is okay. They're both appropriate. I'd be okay with either one. I would vote yes on cloture on the bill if we were going to go through either of those first two doors. But door three is the one that the majority leader appears likely to open. And behind door three is a very different alternative, one where the majority leader says, I don't want to vote on it as is, but I also don't want to allow an open amendment process. In fact, I'm going to allow one and only one amendment, and that amendment will gut the continuing resolution passed by the House of the single most important provision relative to its ability to pass the House. the provision defunding Obamacare. Door 3 is unacceptable. Door 3 is unacceptable because it allows the majority leader to gut the House-passed continuing resolution funding government but defunding Obamacare. I find Door 3 unacceptable, and because I find Door 3 unacceptable, I'm not going to help the majority leader get there. If he wants to get there with the help of himself, his own vote, and the 53 Democrats who follow him in his conference, that's fine. Let them do that. If he wants to try to convince some Republicans to join him in that effort to make it easier for him to gut the House-passed continuing resolution, to strip out the language defunding Obamacare, then that's the prerogative of any who may choose to go along with him. I choose not to do that because I was elected to fight this law, not to facilitate its implementation. I don't want to facilitate its implementation. I therefore don't want to facilitate the demise of what I regard as the single most important provision of the House-passed continuing resolution. I will therefore vote against cloture on the bill. Senator Cruz, how do you view the upcoming cloture vote? I'm speaking here not of cloture on the motion to proceed, but on cloture on the bill, on the House-passed continuing resolution.
I thank my friend from Utah for that question. Look, on the motion to proceed, on the decision whether to take up the bill, I think there's widespread agreement we should take up this bill, that there is no more important bill we could be debating right now than this. Indeed, in my view, there should not be just 3 senators in this chamber. There should be 100. Because the urgency facing this country from Obamacare is such that we have nothing better to do. When James Hoffa, the president of the Teamsters, says that Obamacare is a nightmare, frankly, senators shouldn't be asleep while the nation's undergoing a nightmare. The vote that matters is the vote on cloture on the bill that will occur on either Friday or Saturday of this week. That vote, if 60 senators vote yes for cloture, that's a vote to shut off debate. That's a vote to say we will not debate anymore. And what it does is it opens the door, it sets the stage, it allows Majority Leader Harry Reid to fully fund Obamacare with just 51 Democratic votes. That means from the Republican side of the aisle that any Republican that votes along with Harry Reid, and you quite rightly note that Leader Reid and presumably all of the Democrats will vote for cloture on a bill with which most, if not all of them, disagree, because they get the joke. There's no mystery to this. When the Majority Leader has announced, I'm going to shut off all other amendments and I'm going to add one amendment to totally gut the bill and to transform it, to do to this bill what they did to this bill. Can you imagine if we were debating cloture? This is actually a very good analogy now that imagine if this bill were coming over, the bill that was turning into Obamacare, and we had the same procedural arrangement, a cloture vote first at 60 votes, and then all amendments to be approved at 51 votes. And imagine if Republicans said, you know what? I support an act to amend the Internal Revenue Code to modify the first-time homebuyer credit in the case of members of the armed forces. That's a good idea, so I'm voting yes for cloture. Because that's the bill I support. It's the bill that came over. It's the bill that I have right now. Imagine that were the scenario, and imagine Majority Leader Harry Reid had announced, once we get cloture, I'm going to offer an amendment to strip every word of that bill you say you support, strip it all out, and to replace it with 2,000 pages of Obamacare. Now, I would suggest that any Republican who stood up and said, I'm voting for cloture to give Harry Reid the ability to strip out the bill that I support, which he said he's going to do, and to replace it with a bill that I say I oppose, and not just oppose slightly, that I say I oppose passionately, I would suggest that would be beyond irrational. Indeed, it would be so irrational to do that that I would suggest no member of the Senate is capable of such irrationality, which means if they're saying that, it is for a deliberate purpose. It is because they affirmatively desire that outcome, and yet they want to be able to tell their constituents something different. It is fundamentally the same dynamic that leads to the cynicism about Washington, that our elected leaders don't listen to us. Now, I want to note on a different front, serving in elected office is a tremendous privilege. It is a humbling experience. You get to meet people from all over your state, sometimes from all over the country. You get to meet incredible people. You get to meet people who have done remarkable things. One of the people I've been privileged to meet is my colleague and friend, Senator Mike Lee, who we've learned tonight a number of extraordinary things about him, a number of things that border on the superhuman. Number one, we've learned that Senator Mike Lee would be willing to purchase a ton of rocks and a Barry Manilow record simply to bring his wife milk and eggs. Now, that's extraordinary matrimonial fidelity. But number two, we've learned that Senator Mike Lee, as a boy, could be run over with a Buick filled with 7 people and not have his foot injured. That, too, is extraordinary and superhuman. And number three, we've been privileged with a tour de force constitutional lecture with no notes, with no materials in front of him, that frankly was reminiscent to me of a former boss of mine. You know, Senator Lee is the son of a legend in law. His late father, Rex Lee, was the Solicitor General of the United States. I did not have the opportunity to meet his late father, but have known him by reputation for much of my life because he was revered as one of the finest Supreme Court advocates to have ever lived. And I think Mike was all but weaned on the Constitution as a young lad. But the discourse that Senator Lee just presented to this nation reminded me of my former boss, Chief Justice William Rehnquist, who, like Senator Lee, had a deep love for the Constitution, like Senator Lee, had an encyclopedic knowledge of the Constitution, and could weave the battles we have had to rein in government power and protect individual liberty into a tapestry, a narrative that explains what it is we're fighting for. And so I will say, as we stand here now at 3:35 in the morning, I feel privileged. I feel fortunate to be standing side by side with my friend. And I will say this: if ever I am threatened by a Buick with 7 people in it, I want Mike Lee's foot between me and the Buick.
Will the gentleman yield for a question?
I am happy to yield for a question without yielding the floor.
First of all, by way of clarification, it was not a Buick but an Oldsmobile, and those were not rocks I was purchasing in my hypothetical. It was instead a half-ton of iron ore. I'm not sure that it's critical to the merits of the story, but I did think that deserves some clarification. I'm not certain that I would, in fact, do that. I want to be very clear. I didn't, in fact, engage in a transaction like that. But it does remind me of how we're often asked to vote here. We tie together program after program. Things are funded not on their own merits, but on the merits of other programs. When you tie every single piece of government spending together, then all of a sudden it becomes a must-pass piece of legislation. Everybody sinks or swims together, and it becomes a practice of collusive spending in which Congress funds things not because each program deserves to be funded, but because nobody wants to have his or her ox gored. and that does become a problem. I appreciate the Senator's comments about my late father. He's been dead for the last 17 years. We miss him. We've missed him every day since then. The Journal of the American Bar Association once referred to him as Huck Finn in a morning suit, referring to the ceremonial dress worn by the United States Solicitor General. They regarded him as sort of a Huckleberry Finn character, not typical that a boy from the Rocky Mountains, as he used to describe himself, ends up in that position, but he loved that position, loved it very much. It's worth noting and inquiring into that I have met the father of the junior senator from Texas. He's an inspiring speaker. He is a true patriot. Even though he was not born or raised in this country, the senator's father has a great love of the United States of America that is unparalleled, certainly unexceeded by almost anyone that I've ever met. And he's one that certainly can understand the angst that the American people feel about laws like Obamacare. He's someone that I think can understand that in many respects the very best kind of jobs program that the United States Senate could enact, as my friend Jared Stone from Danville, California recently told me, would be legislation defunding Obamacare. Because as my friend Jared Stone pointed out to me, Obamacare presents a sort of double whammy for the American people. At once, it both imposes a massive new tax on the middle class and at the same time kills job opportunities for the middle class. Most people who work in real jobs or want to have a good job understand this, and that's why the overwhelming majority of Americans want the Senate to defund Obamacare. This is a principle that I think the father of the junior senator from Texas understands very well. The father of the junior senator from Texas came here as a young man, initially working as a restaurant, waiting tables, as I recall. This was a young man who had escaped tyranny in various forms. Originally, the form of tyranny that Cuba saw under Castro's predecessor, Fulgencio Batista. And he had quite an experience coming to this country. I was wondering if the junior senator from Texas would be willing to share a little bit more about his father's story, the story of Rafael Cruz, how he came to this country, and how the senator's father might look upon Obamacare based on his rather unique experience coming to this country.
Well, I thank my friend from Utah for his very kind comments regarding my father. And I will say that he and I, to paraphrase Sir Isaac Newton, who said, "If I have been able to see a little bit further, it is only because I have stood on the shoulder of giants." And I will say one thing that Senator Lee and I are both very fortunate, is we are blessed to be the sons of fathers whom we admire immensely, and who I think for both of us played a big, big part in trying to raise us up to be principled, to fight for liberty and to fight for the Constitution. My dad, you think about the journeys to freedom that constitute who we are as the American people. All of us have a story. Doesn't matter in any group you go to. You could get 1,000 people in an audience, and each person could come up to the microphone and tell their story, their family story, of someone who risked everything to be here. My dad, as a kid, was born in Cuba. We mentioned earlier that his father had had come from the Canary Islands when he was 1. And as a young man, my dad was 14 when he began getting involved in the Cuban Revolution. And at the time, Batista was the dictator. Batista was cruel, he was corrupt, closely aligned with the mafia, and he was oppressive. And the revolution occurred. My dad was a 14-year-old boy. I'm looking at the pages who are down here now who are older than 14. And I would suggest if you could imagine at the age of 14 finding yourself in a war, finding yourself fighting a war, hoping to liberate your country, being asked to fight against the army, being asked to fight for freedom. And the revolution was being fought on behalf of Fidel Castro, and indeed my father was one of many freedom fighters who fought on behalf of Castro. And my father didn't know Castro. He was a kid. He was not a high-ranking person in the revolution. And I can tell you my dad and the kids who were fighting, none of them knew at the time that Fidel Castro was a communist. As my father describes it today, he said, look, we were all 14 and 15-year-old boys. We were too dumb to know any better. We were just fighting for freedom. We just wanted to get out from under the boot of Batista. For 4 years, my father fought in the revolution. When he turned 17, my dad went out partying. And he enjoyed, he was enjoying himself. He was a 17-year-old young revolutionary. He was in a white suit. You know, Senator Lee, Latins love white suits, and he was in a white suit. He was partying it up in Havana. And he disappeared. And for several days, my grandfather went looking for him. Now, my grandparents knew their son was involved in the revolution. He hadn't hid that from his parents. And they also knew that if your son is involved in the revolution and he disappears, it is a bad, bad thing. Well, after searching for him for several days, searching the jail, searching around, they found my dad. And he was in a jail, and he'd been imprisoned, and he'd been tortured. Now, I'll confess to this day, I don't know a lot about what happened. And, look, different people have different experiences. My father doesn't talk much about it. To the best of my knowledge in this body, other than our colleague Senator John McCain, whom all of us respect immensely for his tremendous service and sacrifice to this nation, other than Senator McCain, I'm not aware of any of our colleagues that have experienced anything like imprisonment and torture. And what my father experienced was a tiny fraction of what John McCain went through in the years he was in that Vietnam prison. But in Cuba, my dad, when I was growing up, never would really tell me what happened there. And I remember one night when I was a kid, I think I was in high school, maybe junior high or high school, I don't remember. And my dad and I had gone to see the movie Rambo. My dad and I both like movies. He'd taken me to see Rambo. And Rambo was a fun movie to see as a kid. And it happened that night, my parents owned a small business, and he had one of his clients over for dinner. And I guess in the course of dinner, my father was talking to his client and was feeling a little gregarious. And he started talking, and he said, my son Ted and I, we went to see Rambo this weekend. And you'll remember there's a scene, a pretty nasty scene, where Rambo is strapped to a bed frame and subject to electric shock. Not a very pleasant scene in the movie. My dad was saying, the Cubans weren't nearly so fancy when it came to torture. We watched the movie Rambo. They didn't have any fancy bed frames and electric shock or anything. So the Cubans were much more simple in their torture. Basically, they just come in every hour and beat the living daylights out of you. They'd just beat you and beat you and beat you. And they'd leave and then come back in an hour and do it again. And I can tell you my grandmother said that when my dad came out of that jail cell in Cuba, that the white suit he was wearing, my grandmother told me you couldn't see a spot of white on it. That every inch of that suit was covered with mud and blood from where he'd been beaten, that my father's teeth, she said, were dangling from his mouth in shards. Today, my father's a pastor in Dallas, and his front teeth are not his own because when he was a kid, they were kicked out of his mouth in a Cuban jail. He got out of that jail, and at that point, my grandfather told him, said, look, Rafael, they know who you are now. In fact, the Batista police were following my dad, hoping he would lead them to others in the revolution. It's the only reason he got out is because they thought, well, maybe if we let him go, he'll be dumb enough to go to some other people in the revolution. We can track them down, too. And my grandfather said, listen, they know who you are. At this point, they're just going to hunt you down and kill you. You can't stay here. So my father applied to 3 U.S. universities. He applied to the University of Miami. He applied to LSU. And he applied to the University of Texas. And it was pure happenstance. The first one to let him in was the University of Texas. Had it been otherwise, had it been the University of Miami, I might today be a constituent of our friend Marco Rubio's. But it so happened it was the University of Texas, and that led to my father getting on a plane in 1957 when he was 18. I want to again talk to the pages who are here. Some of you may be 18 or near it. I want you to imagine at the age 18 getting on a plane away from your family, flying thousands of miles away to another country. The country where you don't know anybody. You don't have any family. And you don't speak the language. Imagine walking off the plane. My father he had the suit on his back. He couldn't take anything with him. You couldn't take a suitcase. You couldn't take anything. He was wearing a suit. The one possession he had was a slide rule that was in his pocket, which I see looks of somewhat confusion on the face of the pages. I will note any time that I talk to young people, they have utterly no idea what a slide rule is. But that was the one possession he had that he could take from Cuba. And he had what my grandmother had done before he left, is she sewed $100 into the inside of his underwear because she wanted him to have at least a little bit of money when he landed. So 1957, he shows up in Austin. Look, his first priority is he needed to get a place to live, so he went and found a place to live. Then he had to get a job. And the job he got was washing dishes. Why washing dishes? Because you didn't have to speak English. He couldn't speak English. Made 50 cents an hour. You didn't have to talk to anyone. You'd take a hot dish, stick it under hot water, scrub it, and move on to the next one. That he could do. You know, my dad worked 7 days a week, washing dishes and then as a cook, to pay his way through the University of Texas. And look, times were tight. I got to tell you, I can't imagine. I didn't have to go through it, and I don't believe Senator Lee had to go through the experience of going to school full-time and working full-time. My dad worked 7 days a week while he was going to school full-time as a student. Now, one that he wanted to was that he didn't have any other alternative. There wasn't anyone else providing for him. Remember a couple of stories my father told me of their times in college. And, Madam President, with your indulgence, I'll share those stories because they are stories, I think, of the American experience, of the shared experience. You know, he used to eat. The great thing about working in a restaurant is they let you eat while you worked. So during the 8 hours, he would eat those 8 hours. The other 16 hours, he wouldn't eat. Now, it was even better when he got promoted to being a cook. Because as a cook, you really got a chance to eat. So, for example, one of the things the restaurant served is fried shrimp. My dad had a policy, anyone ordered a dozen shrimp, he'd cook 13 and eat one. But of course of the day, a lot of people ordered fried shrimp, and he'd just eat one steadily throughout the day. My dad used to try to drink 6 or 7 glasses of milk during the day. He figured there's no percentage in water. I need the nutrients. Because when he left, he was going another 16 hours without eating till he came back to work the next day because he didn't have money for food. Now, there was one little exception, which is there was a coffee shop he found in town where he went in one day and he splurged. It was one of the few times he actually spent money, and he spent money for a cup of coffee. And another gentleman at the coffee shop came in and ordered some toast. And he saw the waitress take out a bag of a fresh loaf of bread, take both of the heels, throw them away, and then take 2 other slices of bread, put them in the toaster, start cooking. My father said, "What are you doing? You're throwing away perfectly good food." And she said, "Well, we can't serve the heels." And my father, look, when you're desperate and you're hungry, you have incentives to do all sorts of things. My father said, "Listen, do me a favor. Save them for me. Just save them for me. If you can't serve them, I'll eat them." And he used to go into that coffee shop, and that waitress very kindly would save the heels when she opened it. And she would, when he'd come in, she'd have, 5 or 6 or 7 heels. She'd toast them up. She'd give him butter. And he'd order 1 cup of coffee, and he'd have 5 or 6 heels of toast and drink his coffee. Another similar story, he went over to some friends of his. There were a lot of immigrants at the University of Texas who didn't have 2 nickels between them. He went over to some friends of his, I think were brothers, who invited him over for dinner. And he's sitting down for dinner, and it's a big pot of black beans. Cubans love black beans. And when he's reaching in to get black beans, they say, "Watch out for the nail." He says, "Watch out for the nail? What on earth are you talking about?" And these 2 brothers explained, said, "Look, we don't have money for food. So what little money we have enough to have beans each night, and we have enough to purchase a little tiny paper-thin steak." And the brothers said, "Listen, we initially started, we'd cut the steak in half, we'd each eat it, and to be honest, we both left hungry. We weren't happy with that. So we decided instead of doing that, what we'd do is we'd take a nail, we'd drop it in the beans, and we'd fish for the nail. Whoever got the nail with their beans got the whole steak. And the other brother didn't get any steak at all." And they said, "Raphael, since you're our guest," now he's kind of waiting for them to say, "We're going to give you the steak." And they're like, they were not quite that generous. "Since you're our guest, we'll give you half the steak. We're going to fish for the nail for the other half." One other story. As freshman or sophomore year, I'm not sure when, my dad and a couple of other Cubans who were students there, they decided they wanted to have a Christmas dinner. And the Cuban tradition for Christmas is to roast a whole pig. Indeed, if I may take a digression, when I was dating my wife, Heidi is the love of my life. She's my best friend. She was raised in California. She and her whole family vegetarian. And I remember Heidi brought me back to meet her parents for Christmas. And we're sitting there having Christmas dinner, and I will note, a vegetarian Christmas dinner is just like any other Christmas dinner, except the entree never comes. Everything else is wonderful, but you keep waiting for them to bring out the entree, and it's not there. And my now in-laws, who are wonderful, tremendous people, who were missionaries and are just wonderful people, they were trying to get to know this strange young man that their daughter had brought home. And they said, "Okay, well, Ted, tell us, how does your family celebrate Christmas?" And I said, "Well, we're Cuban, and the Cuban tradition is on Christmas Eve we roast a whole pig." I must tell you, the look of abject horror. If you could imagine a table full of California vegetarians, when I said we roast a whole pig, I don't think if I had said that we consume live kittens, it would have more horrified them than that so viscerally carnivorous tale. But my dad decided, and a couple of his Cuban buddies, that they wanted to have a Christmas dinner and they wanted to actually, celebrate. And so they drove to a farm just outside of Austin. They found some farmers in Central Texas, and they said, "Listen, is there any chance we could somehow just buy a little piglet from you, do something so we could get it and roast it? We'd like to have a Christmas Eve dinner." And these farmers, I think they decided they wanted to have fun with my dad and with these kids. And they said, "I'll tell you what, we'll take this little piglet, we're going to let him loose in a corral filled with mud. If you can catch it, you can have him for free.
And my dad and his friends chased that piglet, I think for close to an hour, running around in the mud, trying to get, they finally caught the piglet. Farmers gave it to them. They took it home, roasted it for Christmas Eve. Now, the epilogue to the story about my in-laws is that when Heidi and I became engaged, her mother called her and said, "Sweetheart, are you prepared to catch the pig?" Now, thankfully, Heidi reassured her that she was quite confident in our marriage there would be no pig catching that she would be carrying out, and that has indeed proven true. But, you know, all of those stories, look, they're stories all of us have. All of us have stories about our families. And my father has been my inspiration ever since I was a kid, because I think it's a great blessing, it's a tremendous blessing to be the child of someone who's fled oppression, to be the child of someone who's came here seeking freedom, because it makes you realize what we have in the United States of America, it is precious, it is wonderful, it is unique. And we cannot possibly risk giving it up. But at the same time, I am amazed at how commonplace my father's story is. Every American has a story just like that. Now, sometimes it's us, sometimes it's our parents, sometimes it's our great-great-great-great-great-grandparents. But I have yet to encounter someone that doesn't have a story like that in their background, often closer than one might think. And I think the most shared characteristic among all of us is, as Americans, we are the children of those who risked everything for freedom. You know, sometimes people ask, what differentiates Americans from, say, Europeans, Americans from people of other countries? And I think more than anything, it is in our DNA to value liberty and opportunity above all else. And it is why, listen, when Obamacare was being passed 3.5 years ago, I think the proponents believed, in fact, they stated that once it's in place, Americans would come to love it and would give up their liberty, would give up their freedom in exchange for bread and circuses. And yet 3.5 years later, we see Obamacare is less popular now than it was then. And that's true, by the way, all over the country. That's true in every region, and that's true among Republicans, among Democrats, among independents, among libertarians. Now, there's several reasons for that. One is just simple facts. Forget party ideology or affiliation. The simple facts is this thing isn't working. If you just look at it, on its face, it is a train wreck, as the Democratic senator who was the lead author of Obamacare has described it. On its face, it is a nightmare, as James Hoffa, the president of the Teamsters, has described it. Obamacare in practice is killing jobs all over this country. It is causing small businesses to stay small, not to grow, not to create jobs. It is causing Americans all over this country to be forcibly reduced to 29 hours a week. And you know who's being reduced the most? It ain't the rich. It ain't, as the president likes to put it, the millionaires and billionaires. Millionaires and billionaires are doing just great. They are richer today than when President Obama was elected. I think in fact, the biggest lie in politics is the lie that Republicans are the party of the rich. I think it's a complete and total falsehood. Rich to great with big government. Big business does great with big government. Why? Because big business gets in bed with big government. What have we seen with Obamacare? The rich and powerful get special exemptions. Big businesses, the president exempts them. Members of Congress, the president exempts us. It's the little guy that doesn't have an army of lobbyists, doesn't have special interests. The little guy is the one left out. So who are the people losing their jobs? Who are the people being forcibly reduced their hours? Who are the people facing skyrocketing health insurance premiums? Who are the people having their insurance dropped? It's people like the disabled retirees whose letters I was reading earlier today. It's people like my father. Listen, if Obamacare were the law in 1957, when my father was washing dishes, I think it is a virtual certainty that he would have found his hours forcibly reduced to 29 hours a week if he had been lucky enough to get a job in the first place. He might not have been hired at all. That's happening to people all over the country. And you know what? The people who are losing under Obamacare are people like my dad. Teenage kids who don't speak English, who are recent immigrants, who are Hispanic, who are African American, single moms. If you were a single mom working, waiting tables, you know, I have a good friend of mine who's now a justice on the Texas Supreme Court, whose mom was a single mom, who waited tables, and he computed the distance she walked as a waitress to bring him up. And I don't remember the exact measurement, but it was some remarkable number of times walking from the earth to the moon and back that she walked so that her kids could have a better life. That single mom is waiting tables. Her son is a justice on the Texas Supreme Court. Look, that's the story of America. But you know what? If Obamacare had been in place, that single mom waiting tables, guess what? She's working 29 hours a week. Try feeding a family on 29 hours a week. Can't do it. Cannot be done. So what happens instead? People get their hours forcibly reduced. They either can't earn enough to feed their family, so they leave the workforce altogether and they go on welfare. Not that they want to be. They want to be working. But if Congress has passed a law that has given them the only job they can get is 29 hours a week, and that's not enough to feed their family, you look at right now, 1 in 7 Americans is on food stamps. What a travesty. And it's not, look, it's not a travesty from the perspective of the budget. Not a travesty from the perspective of the taxpayers. It's a travesty from the perspective of those people on food stamps who'd rather be working, who'd rather be having the dignity of work to provide for their family and to climb the economic ladder. Look, my dad started washing dishes, but he didn't stay there. After washing dishes, he got a job as a cook. After a cook, he got a job as a teaching assistant. After a teaching assistant, he got hired at IBM as a computer programmer. And then he started his own business. If he doesn't get hired washing dishes, he doesn't get the next job as a cook, he doesn't get the next job as a teaching assistant, he doesn't get the next job at IBM, he doesn't get the next job starting his own business. So if you look at those single moms who are waiting tables suddenly get their hours forcibly reduced to 29 hours a week, if she ends up giving up, going on food stamps, going on welfare, saying, I can't earn enough in the market to provide for my family, not only does that have devastating effects on her kids, but it also means she won't have a chance to move up the ladder. She won't have a chance to get that next job. Maybe if she was waiting tables, she would get promoted to being assistant manager and then a manager. Maybe she'd have another opportunity moving up the ladder. But you know what? If she doesn't get on that first rung, we know to an absolute certainty you won't go to the second or third rung. What a travesty. This is a country of unlimited opportunity. And Obamacare is cutting off that opportunity. It is shutting down that opportunity. Those are who are hurt the most under Obamacare. There are many reasons why Obamacare is problematic. It's problematic because it's the biggest job killer in America. It's a train wreck because it's forcing more and more people to be driven into part-time work 29 hours a week. And by the way, the second thing the single mom can do, suppose she doesn't give up. Suppose she says, darn it, I want to work to provide for my kids. I'm not going to give up. I'm not going to go on welfare and stop in the workplace. So what does she do? The other option is go find another job. So then she has 2 jobs at 29 hours a week. Now, you know what? Her kids now see less of their mom. And 2 jobs at 29 hours a week. By the way, neither one gives her health care. So the Affordable Care Act, all the great benefits of that hadn't helped her at all. But instead of being at one job where she could work and focus on that one job and potentially climb the ladder to different opportunities, she's at two working part-time, and part-time jobs are much harder to advance in your career with. She's also dealing with commuting. She's got to get from one job to the other. Now listen, for a single mom for whom time is at a premium, who would like to be at her kid's soccer game, if ever she could work the schedule to do that. But if she's got to drive from one place to the other, back and forth, there are a lot of soccer games that single mom is never getting to. Not to mention the headaches of having two different jobs and two different bosses. If you have boss number one that says, I want you to work Tuesday morning, and boss number two says, I want you to work Tuesday morning at my place. How do you balance those? Both of them say, look, I don't care about your other job. I need you here. What a nightmare. Obamacare is a train wreck. It is a nightmare because it's killing jobs, because it's driving up health insurance, because it's causing more and more people to lose their health insurance. But it's also fundamentally wrong for a broader reason, because it infringes on our liberty. Listen, the federal government is telling every American, you must purchase health insurance, the individual mandate. We're going to make you purchase health insurance, and if not, the IRS is going to come and fine you. Federal government is telling Catholic churches, or rather Catholic charities and Catholic hospitals, and Christian companies like Hobby Lobby, you must pay for abortifacients for health insurance procedures that violate your religious dictates. Now, they may not violate everyone's religious dictates. There may be people, there may be a lot of people in this country for whom they have no religious qualms about that whatsoever, and that's fine. Each of us is entitled and indeed encouraged to seek out God Almighty with all of our heart, mind, and soul as best we can, and we will follow different paths. But I guarantee you, if the federal government can tell Catholic charities and Catholic hospitals, you must violate your religious beliefs or we're going to fine you, out of business. The federal government can tell that to Hobby Lobby, a Christian company. They can tell that to you too. Whatever your religious beliefs happen to be, if the federal government can say, violate your religious faith, or we're coming after you, that is a dangerous, dangerous Rubicon that we have crossed. And you know, we're a nation that was founded on liberty. Always defend liberty. You know, you really can't go wrong with that as a motto. In the interest of that, I'd like to share a few excerpts from one of my favorite books, Atlas Shrugged by Ayn Rand. Now, let me encourage any of you who have not read Atlas Shrugged to go tomorrow, buy Atlas Shrugged, and read it. What's interesting is in the last 3 years, my understanding is sales of Atlas Shrugged have exploded because we are living in the days of Ayn Rand. So I just want to share a few excerpts that are all fundamentally about liberty and the liberty that Obamacare infringes. Productiveness is your acceptance of morality, your recognition of the fact that you choose to live, that productive work is the process by which man's consciousness controls his existence, a constant process of acquiring knowledge and shaping matter to fit one's purpose, of translating an idea into physical form, of remaking the earth in the image of one's values. That all work is creative work if done by a thinking mind, and no work is creative if done by a blank who repeats in an uncritical stupor a routine he has learned from others. That your work is yours to choose, and the choice is as wide as your mind, that nothing more is possible to you and nothing less is human. That to cheat your way into a job bigger than your mind can handle is to become a fear-corroded ape. There's a phrase you don't hear often in modern parlance, fear-corroded ape, on borrowed motions and borrowed time. And to settle down into a job that requires less than your mind's full capacity is to cut your motor and sentence yourself to another kind of motion, decay. My, is that happening across this country as a result of Obamacare. People being forced to settle down into jobs that require less than our mind's full capacity. That your work is the process of achieving your values, and to lose your ambition for values is to lose your ambition to live. That your body is a machine, but your mind is its driver. And you must drive as far as your mind will take you, with achievement as the goal of your road. That the man who has no purpose is a machine that coasts downhill at the mercy of any boulder to crash in the first chance ditch. That the man who stifles his mind is a stalled machine, slowly going to rust. That the man who lets a leader prescribe his course is a wreck being towed to the scrap heap. And the man who makes another man his goal is a hitchhiker no driver should ever pick up. That your work is the purpose of your life, and that you must speed past any killer who assumes the right to stop you. That any value you might find outside your work, any other loyalty or love, can only be travelers you choose to share your journey, and must be travelers going on their own power in the same direction. A few other excerpts. What is morality? She asked. Judgment to distinguish right and wrong, vision to see the truth, and courage to act on it. Dedication to that which is good, integrity to stand by the good at any price. Boy, that's counsel that the United States Senate should listen to. That's counsel that I would encourage every Democratic senator who feels the urge of party loyalty to stand by their party, to stand by Obamacare, because it's the natural thing to do. And yet we saw union leaders, we saw the Roofers Union, we saw James Hoff of the Teamsters say they cannot remain silent any longer. Why? Because of the suffering Obamacare is visiting on so many working men and women. It's a nightmare, according to James Hoff of the Teamsters. I would encourage my friends on the Democratic side of the aisle, as difficult as it is to cross one's party leaders, I say, with perhaps a little familiarity in the consequences of so doing, that it's survivable, and that ultimately it is liberating. That if the Democratic senators of this body maintain their fidelity, their loyalty, not to the party apparatus, not to the party bosses, but to the men and women who sent them here. To the men and women like the union members of the Teamsters who are pleading with members of Congress, here are suffering, Obamacare is a nightmare. With that prism in mind, let me reread Ayn Rand's excerpt here. What is morality, she asked. Judgment to distinguish right and wrong. Vision to see the truth. And courage to act upon it. Dedication to that which is good. Integrity to stand by the good at any price. And you know, at any price, look, at the end of the day, if a member of the Senate bucks his or her party leadership, to be honest, the prices are all pretty piddling. What a coddled world we live in, that we think if someone says a cross word to you at a cocktail party, or, God forbid, even worse, leaks a scurrilous line to some reporter, that truly that is a grievous insult. Goodness gracious, compared to the suffering people have gone through, compared to the suffering my dad went through being tortured in a Cuban prison, that's all mild. To be honest, compared to the single moms who are just wanting to provide for their kids, give them a good home, give them a good example, help them get a good future, the retribution any political party can impose on us for daring to buck the leadership is so mild and inconsequential as not even to be worth mentioning. So let me encourage every Democratic senator to try to meet that definition of morality: judgment to distinguish right and wrong, vision to see the truth, and the courage to act upon it, dedication to that which is good, and integrity to stand by the good at any price. And let me encourage my Republican colleagues. There may be some Republicans that are inclined to vote for cloture on this bill, to give Majority Leader Harry Reid and the Democrats the ability to fund Obamacare on a straight party line vote. I know some of my colleagues have publicly said they are so inclined. It is my sincere hope between now and the vote on Friday or Saturday that their better angels prevail. You know, listen, the same dynamics that the Democrats face. Listen, any Democrat that crosses the aisle to vote with us will face swift retribution. But at the end of the day, we have a higher obligation. We have an obligation to the constituents who sent us here. And any Republican, I know there are some Republicans who are saying, I'm going to support cloture. I'm going to support giving Harry Reid the ability to fund Obamacare. Why? Because my leadership is telling me to. And I'm a good soldier. I will salute and march into battle in whatever direction leadership instructs. And I'll confess, Republicans are sometimes even more susceptible to such commands, to being orderly. And let me commend to every Republican. Ask yourself that same test that Ayn Rand laid out. What is morality? Judgment to distinguish right and wrong. Vision to see the truth and courage to act upon it. Dedication to that which is good. Integrity to stand by the good at any price. I can tell you this, if any one of the 46 Republicans in this body asks ourselves not, what does our party leadership want us to do? But asks ourselves the more important question, what do our constituents want us to do? I can tell you this, if I get any gathering of Texans, Texans aren't conflicted. If I asked a gathering of Texans, and by the way, it doesn't matter what part of Texas, East Texas, West Texas, the Panhandle, down in the Valley. I was in a gathering down in the Valley a few weeks ago. Rio Grande Valley in Texas is the poorest part of the state. My friend Senator Lee knows the Valley well because he was a missionary down in the Valley. In fact, he has darn good Spanish as a result of living in the Valley in Texas. In fact, I think that gives Texas a reason to claim him unofficially as a third senator. He may not acquiesce to that, but we'll claim him anyway. But I was at a gathering in the Valley a few weeks ago. It was 200-300 people. I would guess a significant percentage, if not a majority, of the people in that room were probably Democrats. A majority of them were Mexican-American. And, you know, I try to make a policy of giving same remarks, standing for the same principles, regardless if I'm talking with a group that I think will necessarily agree with me or won't. The bulk of the remarks I gave to that group, before taking Q&A from the group for some time, were focused on defunding Obamacare, and it was really striking. In that group, that was largely, if not predominantly, Hispanic Democrats in the Valley in Texas. When it came to defunding Obamacare, to stopping the train wreck that is Obamacare, the result was rousing, sustained applause and cheers. Why? Because if you get out of the partisan prison that is Washington, it's not complicated. There is a reason the labor unions want out. There's a reason the Teamsters, who describe that they have been knocking on doors and the loyal foot soldiers for the Democratic Party are saying this is a nightmare. Repeal Obamacare, and repeal it because it's a nightmare. There is a reason why members of Congress, why Majority Leader Reid and Democratic senators who support Obamacare so much for the American people said, good golly, get us out from under it. We certainly don't want to be subject to the same rules the American people are. There's a reason why the IRS employees union is saying, even though we're enforcing Obamacare, please get us out from under it. Because on the objective facts, this thing isn't working. And so I would urge every Republican who is here, before you make a decision how to vote on cloture on this bill on Friday or Saturday, and I think certainly in the time I have been in the Senate, this is the most consequential vote I will cast, and I believe any member of this body will cast during the time I've been here. I would ask every Republican to ask not simply what does party leadership want you to do. What's the right thing to do for your constituents? If you gathered 100 of your constituents in a room and you asked them, how should I vote on this motion? And let me ask it, let me frame it a little more explicitly. Because, you know, politicians are sometimes crafty characters. Some politicians say, oh, yeah, I could get 100 of my citizens and I could frame it in some abstract procedural way. Well, how would I vote on the cloture to take up the bill to do the whatchamacallit, the whatchabehuddit, and it would really be supporting the House bill, so what do you think? And we can talk fast enough that we can confuse some people in a room for a few minutes. But let me suggest any Republican senator gather at random 100 of your constituents. And I'm going to suggest it even broader, not 100 Republicans, 100 of your constituents, and pose the following question to them. Should I, as your senator, your Republican U.S. senator, vote to allow Harry Reid and the Democrats to fully fund Obamacare with no changes, no improvements to address the train wreck that is Obamacare, on a purely party line partisan vote of only Democrats? I will wager all the money in my bank account that every one of the Republican senators, and by the way, you could pick the bluest state for which a Republican senator represents that state, I will wager that in that state, if you grab 100 of your constituents, it wouldn't be a 50-50 proposition. I don't even think it'd be a 60-40 proposition. Your constituents overwhelmingly would say, no, don't vote to give Harry Reid the ability to fund Obamacare without fixing this train wreck, without stopping this nightmare. All that it takes for us to do the right thing is to listen to the people. It's not complicated. It's not rocket science. Listen to the people. Ayn Rand and Atlas Shrugged also observed, the nation which once held the creed that greatness is achieved by production is now told that it is achieved by squalor. She also observed, fight for the value of your person, fight for the virtue of your pride, fight for the essence of that which is man, for his sovereign rational mind. Fight with radiant certainty and the absolute rectitude of knowing that yours is the morality of life and that yours is the battle for any achievement, any value, any grandeur, any goodness, any joy that has ever existed on earth. God has created men and women to be free creatures. It is not benefiting anyone to strip them of their liberty, to make them dependent on government. Madam President, I cannot tell you how many times I have said, thank the good Lord, that when my dad was a teenage immigrant in Texas 55 years ago, how grateful I am that some well-meaning liberal didn't come and put his arm around him and say, let me take care of you. Let me give you a government check. Let me make you dependent on government. Don't bother washing those dishes. Don't bother working. I'm going to take care of your every need. And by the way, don't bother learning English. I respect your culture so much that I'm going to lock you out of the business and professional classes in this country. I'm going to make sure that if you do work, you're almost surely going to be consigned to menial labor because you can't communicate with the significant majority of Americans. What a destructive thing to do to someone. You know, if someone had done that to my father and he had listened, I am hard-pressed to think of anything that would have been more destructive. And you know, at the end of the day, these points are not partisan or ideological. They're common sense. They're who we are as American. Ask any grandmother. Ask any abuela. What do you want for your grandkids? Do you want your grandkids dependent on government? Do you want your grandkids receiving government support? Or do you want them working? Do you want them working in a job, working hard? Do you want them climbing the economic ladder to success? Do you want them in a career where they can have a better life than you had and, and their parents had? I don't know of a grandmother in this country that would find that a difficult choice. That's a choice that's basic common sense. It's fundamentally destructive to the human spirit not to be able to work and to stand on your own feet. Now, I will say, standing here after 14 hours, standing on your own feet, there's sometimes some pain, sometimes some fatigue that is involved. But you know what? There's far more pain involved in rolling over. Far more pain in hiding. Maybe the Teddy Roosevelt quote. Far more pain in hiding in the shadows. Far more pain in not standing for principle, not standing for the good, not standing for integrity. That's what it means to be an American. We do hard things. To all the Republicans who say, oh, fighting this fight's going to be really hard. I sure hope you didn't run for the Senate because you wanted something easy to do. I sure hope you didn't run for the Senate because you wanted to avoid hard challenges. To the Democrats who say, you know, I couldn't buck the party leadership. Gosh, it would make the White House mad, make the party leadership mad. It would make our leadership in the Senate mad. We got to be united. Team, team, team. We're not a team. We represent the people. You know the team that each of us is on? It's the American team. It's a team where we have an obligation to the men and women who sent us here. And let me be clear, to all the men and women who sent us here, I have an obligation not just to Republicans in the state of Texas, not just to those who voted for me in the state of Texas. Although I'll tell you, I was very pleased. There were quite a few voters in the state of Texas who voted for President Obama and voted for me. Now, you listen to Washington conventional wisdom, they would suggest that is impossible. I was pleased to get a number of Texans who did that. But you know what? Even those who voted against me and disagree with everything I'm doing, I still have an obligation to represent them and to use my best judgment to try to listen to them and fight for them. And I can tell you this, I am convinced that every one of 26 million Texans will be better, will have a better future, a better life in an environment where economic growth comes back, where small businesses are thriving, where they're creating jobs and not shrinking, where there's opportunities, where they're not forcing people into part-time work, but there's full-time opportunities, where there were more people like my dad who are teenage immigrants who can't speak English who can get that first job washing dishes because it lets them get the second job and the third job and the fourth job. I believe in the American dream with all of my heart and might. That's what's being jeopardized by Obamacare, is the American dream. And that is a travesty that ought to outrage and horrify every member of the United States Senate. For everyone on the Republican side who says this is hard, we might be blamed. There might be some political blame. Let's let it all collapse. And boy, I've heard Republicans say that, especially the pundits. Gosh, to get on TV, tell you one of the best ways to get on TV is just advise, run away from any battle that matters. They put you on TV a lot if that's your advice. And what they say is, listen, if Republicans stand up and fight this fight, President Harry Reid might force a shutdown, and Republicans might get blamed. And gosh, that could hurt us politically. And beyond that, this is the really clever Republicans. Obamacare is such a train wreck, such a nightmare. If we just sit quietly, if we just sit silent, James Hoffa said he couldn't sit silent anymore, but Republicans are urged, sit silent. Let Obamacare collapse on its own weight. Never mind that Harry Reid says when it collapses on its own rate, it'll lead us to single-payer socialized health care. Why? Because it'll destroy the private health insurance market. Never mind that. We're told if we do nothing, it'll collapse on its own weight, and everyone will blame the Democrats. Let me be very clear. Who cares? Who cares? Listen, if everyone will blame the Democrats, then consider me the person trying to actively save the Democrats from that blame. I will gladly celebrate any Democrat brave enough to stand up and say, listen, I used to think Obamacare was a good idea. I supported it. And I'm persuaded by the facts. I'm persuaded by my constituents. This thing isn't working. People are hurting. When President Obama reversed course and listened to bipartisan calls to submit his decision to launch a unilateral military attack on Syria to the will of Congress, I happily and loudly praised President Obama for submitting to the constitutional authority of this body. When he did even further, when he listened to the calls from the American people not to put us in the middle of that sectarian civil war, I again happily and enthusiastically praised President Obama for being willing to change his mind, to being willing to turn back because he listened to the voice of the American people. That was the right thing to do. For everyone who thinks this is hard, I'd like to turn to some of my favorite remarks from a Republican president who I would note I suspect many on the Democratic side of the aisle admire as well, because he was one of the most progressive Republicans, although he was not shy in any way, shape, or form. Indeed, Teddy Roosevelt was once giving a speech, and he was shot during the speech. And he finished the speech before seeking medical attention. Now that, you know, there was an old episode on Saturday Night Live, but for the pages, y'all have probably never seen this, but an old episode that was, ¿Quién es más macho? Who is more macho? You know what? Teddy Roosevelt, él es más macho. You get shot in a speech, you stand there and finish the speech, you win. Even Sean Connery's looking at him going, wow, that guy's tough. Well, let me read the words of Teddy Roosevelt that he delivered at the Sorbonne in Paris on April 23rd, 1910. And these are words that everyone who thinks this fight is too hard, that we shouldn't take a risk, that we shouldn't risk political blame, these are words that every one of us should listen to. It is not the critic who counts, not the man who points out how the strong man stumbles or where the doer of deeds could have done them better. The credit belongs to the man or the woman actually in the arena, whose face is marred by dust and sweat and blood, who strives valiantly, who errs, who comes short again and again, because there is no effort without error and shortcoming, but who does actually strive to do the deeds, who knows great enthusiasms, the great devotions, who spends himself in a worthy cause, who at the best knows in the end the triumph of high achievement, and who at the worst, if he fails, at least fails while daring greatly, so that his place shall never be with those cold and timid souls who know neither victory nor defeat. Yeah, you can avoid risk. You can avoid doing the hard things. You can avoid doing the things that you might get politically blamed. You can stay silent and hope that the other party gets blamed, because there'll be political benefits for that. But I'm going to suggest to you that's not doing our job. That's not what we were elected to do. We were elected to stand up and fight to do the hard things for the men and women of this country, because you know what? It is an extraordinary, it is a breathtaking privilege to serve in this body. I cannot tell you how it brings me virtually to tears to think about the opportunity I have to stand here at a time when our nation is threatened like I've never seen before. And you know what? The tears that I said, and now I'm experiencing a little bit, those tears are a very small reflection of the very real tears I've seen from men and women all across Texas. From men and women who have looked me in the eyes, who said, I'm scared for this country, I'm scared for my kids, I'm scared for my grandkids. We're losing America. We're losing the wonderful free enterprise system. We're losing the prosperity, we're losing the growth. Will my kids, will my grandkids have a better life than I did? I don't think so. I cannot tell you how many Texans have said that. And you know what? When you say that, that's not something you say like reporting the weather. Well, it's sunny today and 78 degrees. That's heartbreaking. As Americans, oh, it is fundamental in who we are. We believe in a better tomorrow. We believe morning can come to America. And we believe that our kids and grandkids will live in a better challenge if we continue down this road, if we continue mired in what I call the great stagnation. The last 4 years, our economy has grown on average 0.9% a year. If we continue allowing young people to be what economists are starting to dub the lost generation, I'm sorry to tell young people that's what economists are calling right now. This generation that is coming of age at a time where there is no economic growth and no real prospect for that changing. What it means as a practical matter is young people are not getting that first job, or they're getting jobs, as Ayn Rand observes, that are far less than their mind, than their capacity, than their talent is capable of. And that means they don't get their next job, they don't get their next job, they don't develop to their full potential, and that stays with young people for decades to come. This body needs to listen to the American people. We need to make D.C. listen.